I'm a 29-year-old woman. I've lived in a big city all my life, but at the beginning of April, I moved to a medium-sized town about an hour away from that city, along with my sister and our 4 pets. This incident happened about a month after we moved. My sister was preparing for her final presentation for her arts undergraduate program, which was going to be shown in the city, so she had to spend the whole day there making preparations. I was left home alone with our cats and dogs, so in the early evening, I decided to go for a long walk with my 2 dogs. We walked for about an hour, and as we were headed back, roughly 5 minutes away from our home, I saw a man knocking on a door about a block away. I thought he looked a bit odd because he would knock on the door, look around, then knock again, and then look around once more. He didn't look dangerous, so I kept walking since I had to pass by him to take the street that would lead me home. When I was about 10 meters away, he looked in my direction and started walking toward me. He was tall and slender and was carrying what looked like a box of candy. He asked if I had any coins to spare. I told him, "Sorry, mate, I only have my dog's poop bags. Have a good one." And I was ready to keep walking when he saw one of my tattoos and stopped me. For context, I have tattoos. I'm not heavily tattooed, but I have several on my arms and legs, and since I was wearing shorts, the ones on my legs were visible. The specific tattoo he was looking at is of a ghost woman in a traditional Japanese style. As he stopped me, he said, "That's a really cool tattoo. Would you give it to me?" I laughed uncomfortably, thinking he was joking, but he was dead serious, just staring unblinkingly at my tattoo. He then continued, "No, so you're just gonna let the maggots eat it? Such a shame. It would be better if a person ate it." At this point, he raised his face and looked me straight in the eyes, with a very flat smile that seemed like an attempt to be friendly but only made me feel even more uncomfortable. He then asked for my name, and not wanting to antagonize him, I gave him a fake one. Let's say it was Regina. He then asked if I lived in town, to which I also lied and said that I was from the big city and just visiting. He told me he used to live in that city too, on the streets downtown. He said he used to rap on buses to get money and, out of the blue, started rapping about me, still looking me straight in the eye. He rapped about how I was very pretty, how amazing my tattoos are, and in his rap, he said my name was Lorena. I corrected him, saying my name was Regina, not Lorena, suspecting that he realized I had given him a fake name and was testing me. He just smiled and nodded. He then asked for my number. I told him that my dogs and I had to go home because we were expected. He pointed at a butcher shop a block away and told me we could sit over there while I gave him my number, saying it wouldn't take long. But I told him I couldn't because the one waiting for me at home was my boyfriend, though I was lying again since I was home alone. His smile faded a bit, and he just said, "Well, that sucks." I wished him a good evening and turned to leave, only for him to drop to his knees and grab my leg with both hands. He started caressing my tattoo while whispering, "It really is a goddamn cool tattoo." My dogs are usually friendly and had been calm during this whole exchange, but when he grabbed my leg, they started growling. I pulled my leg out of his grasp, wished him a good evening again, and walked away as fast as I could. I took a longer route home to make sure he didn't follow me, and once home, I took a shower and scrubbed my leg really well since I felt gross after all that. Luckily, I haven't seen him again, but for a while after that, I made sure to cover my tattoos every time I went outside, just in case. This just happened last night, and it still doesn't feel real. In retrospect, I did the right thing and kept myself out of danger, but I realized things could have gone much worse for me. I walked to a bar by myself last night, already intoxicated and just looking for something to do. The entire time, there was a man with a mustache sitting at a table by himself, leering at me. I wasn't dressed up or anything, but I figured he was on something, so I just didn't pay attention to him silently sitting there. Eventually, I'm alone at my table again, about to finish up my drink and leave, when I hear a voice next to me. "You're Morgan." I look up from my phone, and Mustache Man is sitting beside me. "Nope, I'm my first name." I stupidly gave him my real name. It didn't matter, though, because he kept insisting my name was Morgan. "What do you want to own someday, Morgan?" Odd question, but I humored him because that's what you do with crazy people. Nothing in particular. Why?" When I tell you this man got genuinely angry at my response, so I followed it up with, "A house, maybe." He clicked his tongue and cocked his head, looking at me like I'd just failed some kind of test that only he knew the rules to. This man looked at me like he had decided I was worthless, like I deserved whatever fate he was envisioning for me. Listen, dude, you can stay here and chat as long as you aren't one. On some weird drugs, 2, planning on drinking more because I think you've had enough, and 3, not going to murder me. I added the last bit jokingly. Oh, I can't promise I'm going to let you live. I've read the phrase, his eyes darkened, in several romance novels before. I never knew what that was supposed to look like until last night when that man delivered that sentence. And let me tell you, it's not sexy. It's fucking bone-chilling. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to take that as my sign to dip. Maybe he was just joking, but I wasn't taking any chances. I hurriedly approached the bartender, mustache guy got kicked out, and I took an Uber home. When I was 17, I had just gotten my first car. One day, I drove my brother and myself to the dentist. While we were waiting in the lobby, I noticed that someone had parked really badly right next to my car. Since it was new, I was pretty paranoid about it getting scratched or damaged. My brother went in for his appointment, and I decided to move the car to a safer spot. After parking in a new spot, I was walking back to the office. Just before I could cross the parking lot to get inside, a minivan with super tinted windows, so tinted they had this weird blue hue, pulled up so close to me that it almost hit me. I thought it was strange, but I just walked around it. As I was heading to the door, I caught my reflection in the glass and noticed a guy getting out of the van and starting to follow me. At first I didn't think much of it and just started walking faster, but then he started running after me. That's when I realized, okay, this is actually happening, and I started running too. I barely made it to the door before he could grab me. The door was glass and I could see his reflection. He was reaching out, inches away from me. He looked like a totally regular guy, wearing a button-up shirt and khakis, which made the whole thing even more surreal. I ran inside and he didn't follow, probably because he didn't want to be seen. I was completely shocked and kind of in denial about what had just happened because it all went down so fast. I looked out the window and saw him holding a purple cloth in his hand, no idea what that was about. He looked around, then got back in the minivan and sped off. I told the receptionist, but I was still pretty shaken up and confused. The whole thing happened in less than a minute. I've often wondered what would have happened to me if I hadn't run. When I was 21, I worked as an assistant teacher. I had plans to visit friends in another state and intended to spend the summer there, so I subleased my apartment and stayed with my parents for a couple of weeks before I left. My parents lived in a rural area of Wisconsin just south of Madison. I loved to run and would jog in a park near my parents' house after work. This park was basically a mile-long loop, uphill for the first third, level for the next third, and downhill for the final third. It was heavily wooded, and the upper portion was bordered by a rock quarry. In retrospect, it was foolish to jog there alone. There was a small gravel parking area at the entrance to the trail. One day, after work, I hit the trail. As I started uphill, I suddenly felt a sense of panic. I turned around and began running back down the way I'd come, but then decided to complete just one loop. I told myself that it was really hot, and I probably just didn't want to exercise in the muggy heat of late spring. Even so, I couldn't shake this intense feeling that something was wrong. As I neared the end of the loop, I could see the parking area. A cargo van was parked next to my car. I could see someone in the van, but as I became visible through the trees, they were no longer in the front seat. My car was unlocked, as there was rarely anyone at this remote park on a weekday afternoon. There was ample space in the parking area, which made it extra strange that this cargo van was parked right next to me. I decided not to risk it. I ran across the highway and asked a man who was outside on his riding mower to walk me to my car. I explained my concern that there might be someone hiding in the van, and he agreed to walk me to my car and made sure I got out of there safely. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't talked myself into completing that one loop. I think it was my intuition causing me to freak out, not the heat. That was my last solo jog ever. I moved a lot as a kid, and for a few years we lived in Detroit. The neighborhood wasn't nice and some weird stuff happened there. For example, my sister and I were once followed while on a walk when I was 10 and she was 5. I could probably write more than one of these stories. There was a man in the neighborhood that all the kids called Crazy Joe. This was around 1991 or 1992. He drove a rusted-out boat of a car that you could hear coming from a mile away. Whenever we heard his car or saw him walking outside, we would all run and hide. I'm not even sure where he lived. When he walked down the street, he would scream and yell nonsensical things. He had long, matted hair and always looked dirty. One of the urban legends that the kids repeated was that he had an imaginary girlfriend, and once, he was seen screaming at her while stabbing the ground with a large knife. When I was 12, I was babysitting just down the street from where I lived. I noticed Crazy Joe walking on the same side of the street where I was playing out front with the 2 kids I was taking care of. His eyes were locked on me. I didn't want to draw any more attention to myself or the kids, so I tried to corral them into the backyard. They didn't want to go where I was subtly directing them. Crazy Joe kept getting closer and closer with his wild eyes fixed on me. He was carrying a buffalo-checked blanket. At this point, he was about 15 feet away and still locked in on me. The houses were small, single-level homes with small yards. The blanket slipped away, revealing a shotgun pointed at me. I grabbed the 2 kids, shoved them through the front door, locked it, and moved them away from the windows. He didn't fire the gun and didn't come to the door. At least not that I saw. I got us away from the windows, so who knows. The kids didn't realize what was happening, and I ended up just not telling anyone what had happened. I think I was afraid I'd get in trouble. Kid logic. We moved to another state shortly after this happened, and I have no idea what became of that man. I wanted to camp for a night or so I snuck out to a state park without a reservation. Some of these parks allow primitive camping, where you can just set up in the woods without an official campsite. So I snuck in after dark on foot. At some point I took a wrong turn and tried to find a spot off a main trail when someone deep in the woods said, "You better turn around and walk out of here." I left the area, assuming it was just some campers whose site I had almost walked into. I kept my light off to avoid being easily discovered. I left and walked clear across the trail in the other direction, hiding periodically to see if I was being followed, and apparently I was. What became apparent later was that these folks didn't think I would go further into the park, so I heard them on ATVs. Initially, I thought they were just joyriding, but I was wrong. I found a suitable spot, set up, and stayed quiet for a while, hearing nothing. Then I made a mistake. I lit a cigarette. The moment I did, I heard an inhale. I had hidden well enough but accidentally exposed my position. I lay there for a while, hoping nothing would happen, but these people did not leave. They weren't threatened by my verbal attempts to scare them off. They started making weird animal noises, then began talking about my belongings, identified themselves as a gang, and made a final comment about hoping my phone worked. After the phone comment, I lost all hope that these people were up to anything harmless. So I thought, you're right, I do have a phone and I'm using it because this just got out of hand. I called 911 and was on the phone for a while before they hung up. Apparently they couldn't contact the park ranger but were working on it. Definitely not what I wanted to hear. These people became emboldened by the fact that nothing seemed to be happening, and I heard their voices coming closer. I called again, planning to scare them off by grandstanding, but during this call, it was revealed that state troopers were responding, not the ranger. The best news was that they were already at the gate. When I announced that state troopers were coming, the group left immediately, probably because they could see the flashlights on the trail. The big reveal. I heard ATVs racing off through the hills. Those people had waited for me to settle and then searched through the park for me after scouring the back roads. The only reason I think they might not have been entirely sinister is that they didn't actually attack or rob me during the 15-minute lag time between calling the authorities and their arrival. This happened in 2013 when I was around 12. My mom moved me and my siblings in with my grandparents because we didn't have enough money for rent at the time, and she needed to save. It wasn't a big deal though. They had plenty of room and I got to spend a lot of time making jewelry with my grandma, which, in my little eyes, was such a win that I didn't even realize we were that poor. It was our little pastime after school, and one of my favorite parts was the trips we would take to Michael's to get beads and materials occasionally. Michael's, for those unfamiliar, is a craft store similar to Hobby Lobby, and walking around in it is a little girl's dream when it comes to DIY stuff. One day in late fall, we realized we had run out of wire for a bracelet I was making for my mom, so we headed out to our local Michael's to get more. This particular day was in winter, so it had already begun to get dark by 5 p.m. My grandma, having vision problems and a bad hip, entrusted little me to run in, grab the wire, and pay for it as we had done so many times together before. I was stubbornly independent, so she wasn't very worried about me. She parked right in the handicap spot in front of the store. The sun was setting, and the light from the big storefront windows illuminated her car behind me as I walked inside. As I was standing by the display at the front, entranced by some Christmas decor or something, a man walked in through the sliding doors. I noticed him immediately. It was hard not to. He was tall, I think. I may have just been short. Maybe in his mid-30s, with dark hair and wearing all black from head to toe. His clothes were a bit dirty, and I distinctly remember a big red D1 logo on his hoodie. He had his hands shoved in his pockets and walked briskly into the store, almost frantically. I just watched him. He made eye contact with me for a bit too long and then continued deeper into the store. I was immediately weirded out but thought nothing else of it and went off to find the wire. I found my spool of wire, but getting distracted in the toy section was where I messed up. That's when I noticed him start to follow me around. Aisle to aisle, I would be browsing, and he would just appear at the other end, pretending to look at stuff. He was muttering to himself constantly. You know, when someone says something out loud expecting a response, but they aren't really directly looking at you like that. As a kid, you don't immediately realize what's happening, so I just awkwardly walked away from him each time, pretending not to notice him. In my little brain, I reasoned that he wasn't following me, and I walked all the way across the store to the wedding aisle to look at some stuff I had seen when I first walked in. I figured there'd be no way he'd follow me there, but sure enough, while looking at the invitation cards, I got a spine-chilling feeling. I turned around, and there he was, right behind me, with his back to me, doing something, messing with something in his pants, doing something really vile to himself. I had never seen anything like that, and the sunken eyes he looked at me with still haunt me to this day. It took me a minute to process what I had just seen, but once I did, I immediately booked it out of the store as fast as I could. Jumping into my grandma's car, she seemed startled by my sudden appearance and asked what I got. I tried to explain what had just happened when I saw him appear in the sliding door in front of us, and the dread I felt at that moment was indescribable. He approached our car, obviously recognizing I was with my grandma, and knocked on her window. I hadn't been able to explain myself in time before she cracked the window and asked him if everything was okay. The man gestured to me with that same crazy stare and said something along the lines of, "She's a thief. She stole from there." I was mortified that he was trying to make her suspect me, on top of everything else he had just put me through. Thankfully, my grandma got the same vibes I did because she politely told him to back away, rolled the window up, and locked the door. He suddenly yanked at her door handle, then swung both his arms up and started banging down hard on the car's roof, causing us both to jump and me to start crying. My grandma slammed on the reverse and peeled out of there. I've never seen her drive so fast. I don't remember much after that, just the crying and holding a $17 spool of wire in my hands that I hadn't paid for. We called the police as soon as we got home, and luckily they immediately took it very seriously and requested the videotapes from the Michaels. A few weeks later, my grandma told me that they had found him. They mostly left me out of the investigation, besides taking my statement, as to not traumatize me further, I guess. She got the dent in her car fixed, and that was that. It wasn't until a few years later that my mom finally told me what had happened to him. It turns out he already had 1 battery charge and 2 sexual assaults on his record, one even involving a minor relative of his, like his niece or something. He had just gotten off work from the gas station across the street when he must have seen me walk into Michael's alone. I don't know what would have happened if my grandma hadn't locked her door, or if she had been in there with me, vulnerable to that man as well. A friend I will call Robert and I had just spent the day in a city a few hours from our own. We had participated in an event and had a blast. Afterward, we decided to go out and get dinner with a group of our friends, staying in the city until almost midnight before realizing we should probably head home. The drive home was mostly uneventful. The roads between the two cities are very rural, with only a few small towns in between. Since it was dark, we spent most of the drive watching for animals that might run out onto the road while chatting with each other. As we got fairly close to Robert's house, we saw a car parked on the opposite side of the road, facing the wrong way, with a man walking around on and next to the road. The car in front of us happened to be an ambulance, which stopped to try to help the man. As we drove past, I made eye contact with him, and we continued on our way, thinking nothing of what had just happened. We drove for another 30 minutes before turning onto the access road leading to Robert's house. As we drove farther up the road, we noticed another car had turned onto the road farther behind us. Robert lives in a gated community, so we had to turn onto the driveway to go through the gate. This is when we noticed that the car behind us had also turned and was now right behind us. As we pulled up to the gate, Robert opened it, and we drove through. The car behind us also managed to make it in before the gate closed. Neither of us had really thought we were being followed until this point, but even then we joked about it. We drove for a while inside this fairly large neighborhood and noticed the car was still behind us. The route we took was a large curve, so we figured the car should have turned off by now. As we got close to Robert's house, we decided to keep going since the road would loop around, confirming whether we were being followed. At this point, we called Robert's dad, who had just watched us drive by with this car behind us. As we came around the loop, we realized we were indeed being followed. Robert then started driving much quicker through the neighborhood, and the car behind us also sped up. We were going about 50 to 60 miles per hour on these fairly small roads, but the other car kept up. We drove for a while before deciding to head to the front gate, which had a 24-hour security guard. We still weren't sure if the person following us had a key fob to open the gate or not. We left the neighborhood and pulled a U-turn back to the front gate. We were still driving very fast at this point, and to anyone it should have been apparent we were being chased. As we came back to the front gate, Robert was able to open it in a way that prevented us from being followed. But as we turned the corner, we saw the gate opening, and the car that had been following us drove in. This is where we made a huge mistake. We turned down a road without realizing it was a cul-de-sac. As soon as we noticed our mistake, Robert was able to flip the car around so we could get out of there, but as we drove by the car, I made eye contact with the driver, but could barely see his face. When we turned out of the cul-de-sac, we turned off the lights and booked it. We finally managed to shake him and get to Robert's house. We waited at Robert's house for the police to arrive, and shortly after the officer arrived, he got a call on the radio and booked it to his car. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars showed up, and we were informed they had found the car. The man was the same guy we had passed on the side of the road about an hour earlier. When the police first made contact with him, he refused to speak and did not seem to be in the right state of mind. As the traffic stop proceeded, he began threatening officers. We later found out he was a mentally ill and unstable veteran from a couple of states away and had no reason to be anywhere close to where we were. The man had broken the back gate when he followed us in. Worst of all, the guy at the front gate, whose only job was to not let people in without a fob, let this guy in after we had just sped past him. He was quickly fired by the security company. Looking back on this, there is only one thing I would have changed. I would have called the police sooner, but the adrenaline in the moment clouded our judgment.